As we're in the new semester of Rethinking Iran, and given that it's the COVID world, we're very excited to invite scholars and analysts from all over the world to help us better understand the critical juncture of U.S.-Iran relations in particular, which is the main focus of our fall programming, with the idea that conversations in DC and in the US on Iran and the US Iran relations tend to be quite limited, to say the least. Our goal in this initiative is to help broaden this conversation by inviting scholars, analysts, and artists who can help us push beyond the rigid frameworks of the past 40 years. So today's conversation will cover US Iran relations at this critical juncture and also help give us a historical background of how we've gotten to where we are and what we can potentially look forward to given different outcomes of the elections that are coming up in the United States and in Iran. We're very honored to have Ariane Tabatabai join us today for this critical conversation. She'll be joined by my colleague, Professor Vadi Nast. Ariane Tabatabai is the Middle East Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and an adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, or CIPA. Her recent book, which just came out, and I urge you all to look for and order, is entitled "No Conquest, No Defeat: Iran's National Security Strategy." It's a timely history of what drives Iran's security policies towards both its neighbors and its adversaries. Professor Vadi Nast is a professor of Middle East Studies and International Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he spearheads the Rethinking Iran series. He's the author of many books, including, and I'm only going to name a few, are The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy and Retreat, Forces of Fortune, The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World, and The Shia Revival. So without further ado, I turn it over to Ariane, and we look forward to the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us, Ariane.
Marius, thank you so much, and thank you to you, Professor Nast, and to SAIS for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here for this important initiative. As Marius was mentioning at the beginning, the debates and discussions on Iran tend to be fairly limited and sort of myopic in many ways in the city. So I'm really glad that this initiative exists. I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the Iranian perspective on the U.S. election and where we might be going from here, and save the historical conversation for the discussion. I know that the two speakers that have come before me this semester, my colleague Alon Goldenberg and Ambassador Bill Burns, have talked to the state of U.S.-Iran relations. So I figured it might be useful to sort of flip things around and look at how Iran is looking at the elections, what it might be anticipating coming out of the US elections, and how it's planning for what comes next. So let me begin by talking a little bit about how Iran sees this specific election in the United States. In 2016, Iran was fairly, I would say, agnostic about the outcome of the US presidential elections. It saw Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, as being someone who was fairly hawkish on Iran, who would preserve the JCPOA, but who would actually push back on other Iranian policies in the region and elsewhere. And the Republican candidate nominee, now President Trump, didn't really have a track record in terms of foreign policy. And besides a few statements saying that, you know, he did not like the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, he didn't really have a whole lot of information out there about what his actual Middle East policy would look like. So the Iranians, in my mind, were fairly agnostic about the outcome of the elections. This time around, though, things are fairly different. I think Iran is fairly invested in the outcome of the elections because it is quite clear what sort of US governments Iran would be negotiating with or dealing with, depending on who wins the elections. And so that's why Iran has been fairly involved in some of the disinformation campaign. It has made a couple of attempts at hacking the Trump campaign, nowhere, of course, close to what the Russians have been doing, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, but Iran has been fairly active in large part because it does care about what happens this time around. in my mind, the system, the regime has essentially decided to preserve the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, until the result of the elections are known, while at the same time maintaining some level of pressure on the United States, which is why, again, you're seeing things like attempted cyber attacks on not just, by the way, the Trump campaign, but a whole host of private and public entities within the United States, ongoing pressure in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq via proxies, and other types of activities. At the same time, though, and this goes back to the comment I was making, that Iran doesn't actually wants to preserve the JCPOA. It wants to wait and see what happens with the elections before deciding its fate. In that, with the Trump administration's efforts to extend the arms embargo at the UN Security Council over the past couple of months, the attempted effort to snap back UN sanctions on Iran has done a lot of things, but it has tried not to take any steps that would fundamentally implode the deal, that would actually make it very difficult to revive. And actually, interestingly, in my mind, the Trump administration is doing everything it can to make it more difficult for a potential Biden administration to return to the deal. And Iran seems to be seeing through that, and it seems like it is trying to neutralize in some ways the Trump administration's attempts to do so. So what we're seeing is a very carefully crafted series of policies that Iran has been implementing. And that includes uptick and lulls in activities on the nuclear side, for example. Iran has been, of course, pushing the limits imposed by the JCPOA. It's been gradually removing the limits imposed on the JCPOA on its nuclear program, but it's done so in a reversible way. And fundamentally, it has tried not to take actions that would, again, implode the JCPOA altogether. For example, it hasn't decided to kick out inspectors, IAEA inspectors, international inspectors. It has not dialed down the verification and monitoring side of things, which would be really significant steps if Iran were to take them. Similarly, in the region, we've seen, a carefully crafted, calibrated policy of Iranian proxies in Iraq, for example, often targeting U.S. and international positions in Iraq. But at the same time, there seems to have been a bit of a downtick in recent weeks, in part, again, to make sure that nothing was going to tilt the result of the elections, that you wouldn't have an actual confrontation between the United States and Iran. And so what you're seeing often from Iranian officials, from from military commanders in Iran, is statements to the effect that, you know, they're not done retaliating for the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC Quds Force commander, who was taken out, who was killed in January by the United States, but that they are going to do that on their own terms, on their own timelines, and likely after the US elections. So a lot, of course, depends on the outcome of the elections, and Iran is facing a few different scenarios, and I want to kind of highlight a couple of those here. You know, obviously, one set of scenarios stem from President Trump winning his re-election bid. And one thing that he could do is continuing the policy that he has been pursuing since 2018, specifically since May 2018, when he withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal, and to continue this maximum pressure campaign that has characterized his administration's Iran policy. So that is one possibility. But actually, on the flip side, I think there is also a world in which it is possible that President Trump, now no longer facing an election, would decide that he's going to focus on legacy building, that he's actually not that interested in continuing the maximum pressure campaign, and he may decide to dial down the political pressure, the belligerent rhetoric, and even the economic sanctions to create room for some sort of negotiating process, which would be perhaps similar to what we've seen with North Korea. So in my mind, if President Trump is reelected, you could actually see two very different outcomes from that Iran could be facing. The second set of scenarios, of course, would be associated with a potential win for Vice President Biden. Vice President Biden has made it pretty clear that he would return to the nuclear deal if Iran also resumes compliance with it. that he would then work with our allies and partners to build on the deal, that to sort of get a number of arrangements or a bigger deal that would strengthen and extend the nuclear terms of the JCPOA, but that would also tackle Iran's regional and missile-related activities. But a few things can actually complicate these efforts. It wouldn't be necessarily as straightforward. One complicating factor potentially would be the makeup of the new U.S. Congress. Republicans could continue to have the majority in the Senate. They could even regain the majority in the House. And those things would definitely complicate a potential Biden administration's efforts to return to the deal. A second set of challenges is posed by partners in the region. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other actors did not like the JCPOA. They did not like U.S. Iran engagement, and they're not likely to start liking any of those things now. And so they are going to very likely going to continue their efforts to derail any kind of diplomatic effort between the U.S. and Iran. And finally, a third set of, I think, complicating factors stems from not what happens between now and the elections, which, there's been a lot of conversation around town with this whole idea of an October surprise with Iran. But in my mind, what happens between November and January? Of course, Iran could decide that, the retaliation for the killing of Soleimani would take place in that time frame. It could decide that it's going to, again, see an uptick in activities in the region or dial down its compliance with the nuclear deal. But also Israel, for example, could decide that now with Trump, who's been a pretty good ally to Israel, out of office, it would want to take matters into its own hands and perhaps strike nuclear facilities. So a number of things that are both, some of which are within Iran's control and some of which are not, could complicate a potential Biden administration's decision to return to the nuclear deal. So with this in mind, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the domestic challenges that Iran is facing and that may complicate any effort to return to diplomacy in the next few months, and I'll end on that. The first thing to consider is that Iran has its own presidential elections come June 2021. And while I don't think that makes a big difference in terms of the strategic calculations that Iran is making, those are made at a higher level, it is going to have an impact on the negotiations. The second complicating factor domestically for Iran is that the succession of the supreme leader is looming large in the minds of the political elite and military establishment. The supreme leader is fairly old, he's in poor health, and the sort of prospects for what happens next and the planning for what happens next are shaping Iran's internal dynamics today, and they are, of course, shaping Iran's strategic outlook. The third factor is the Iranian economy, which, needless to say, has been in shambles since the maximum pressure campaign reimposed a number of sanctions on Iran and has actually added additional sanctions. And tied to this is the fourth domestic factor, which is the sort of growing discontent within the Iranian population. And the fact that you have a government that doesn't really have a positive and meaningful response to the growing discontent. It doesn't really have a positive way of garnering support within the population right now. So what it's doing is what a lot of authoritarian actors do, which is resort to crackdown and repression. And we've seen that time and again over the past few years, most recently with the execution of one of the protesters from the November 2019 protests. So there are a number of internal challenges and factors that are also very likely to complicate Iran's the decision to return to diplomacy with the United States. So I think I'll stop here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ariane. First of all, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tabatabai to SAIS and to hear her thoughts on the dynamic of U.S.-Iran relations at this critical juncture. So you raised a number of questions, and I would like to sort of go through them. First of all, I think you laid out a scenario in which, at best, progress with Iran is going to be limited, that there are both domestic now sets of issues in Iran, and then also in the United States, the picture is not clear, that there are a number of impediments towards an easy return to where we were in 2015, let's say. But I wanted to start by sort of asking you about the period particularly, and also let me say that you also sort of laid out that the Iranians understand the gravity of this moment and are somewhat limited in the way in which they are pushing against the US, whether it's in the region or in what steps they're taking within JCPOA. But I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what are the red lines? In other words, that what is the sort of the straw that may break the camel's back, either between now and November 3rd or between November 3rd and January 20th, that might push a very different direction in Iran in terms of reaction. So where does the consensus right now about how they're looking at this picture shift?
That's an excellent question, because I think that looking at what has been going on over the past couple of years, especially in the past year, one might have argued that a number of the events that have taken place would have led Iran to actually decide to pull the plug on the JCPOA. I mean, when President Trump announced in May 2018 that he was withdrawing withdrawing the United States rather from the JCPOA, I think many assumed that the JCPOA was going to collapse at some point. And actually, what has happened is that, the JCPOA is a shell of itself at this stage, right? Iran has decided to kind of reduce its compliance with a number of provisions within the JCPOA, especially on uranium enrichment, but actually that it's decided to keep it on life support to see what happens in the elections. In my mind right now, short of a really big event and potentially an unpredictable one, again, a potential strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, I don't see Iran actually making a decision to withdraw from the deal or to kind of explode it, essentially, because it's gone too far and it has paid too much of a price to preserve the JCPOA until this point. The snapback decision by the United States to, again, snap back sanctions on UN sanctions on Iran was one potential, I think, effort. And I think that there are at least parts of the Trump administration that had hoped that by pushing the arms embargo situation at the UN Security Council, by trying to reimpose the UN sanctions, that they would actually lead Iran to leave the JCPOA, and that hasn't happened. And partially, I think it is due to the fact that the United States was deeply isolated on this issue at the UN Security Council. 13 of the 15 members of the UN Security Council voted against the United States, and that includes all of its European allies, closest US allies. So I think that the knowledge that the US, not Iran, is the one that has been isolated over this issue has been an additional driver behind Iran deciding to keep the JCPOA in place until November.
So I'm also going to sort of allow you to make a plug for your book here. So one of the questions that it's always intrigued me is whether we look at the experience of Iran under the Trump administration past 4 years, or we look at the period, let's say, of maximum pressure, or the killing of General Soleimani since January. Question is, has that actually impacted the way Iran looks at its national security strategy? I know you track these kinds of debates in Iran. And again, as I said, I know your book is largely about the sort of logic behind this. Do you see sort of that Iran basically maybe has adopted a different kind of a approach to how it would defend itself, changed its priorities, changed its way in which it even looks at what weapons it needs? How is it positioning itself? So are we really dealing with a different strategic calculus in Iran in 2020 than we were, let's say, in 2013? And I know it's a sort of open-ended question, but I don't think anybody is better positioned than you to take a crack at it.
I do love this question. It's a fantastic question. So, writing the book, one of the things that was striking to me was actually just how similar some of the debates, some of the statements, some of the policies that Iran is pursuing today, that is issuing today, are to things that were said not just 40 years ago or even 100 years ago, but even 200 years ago. That kind of looking at some of the justification behind Iran's policies in the region today. I was finding strikingly similar statements justifying Iran's intervention in Oman 60 years ago. And even before that some of the most problematic, from the US perspective, the most problematic policies that Iran is pursuing today are actually not things that were invented out of the blue in 1979 or even in between 1980 to 1988 during the Iran-Iraq War, but way before that. And that is one of the things that is fascinating to me. And actually the book sort of ends on, I should probably not give that away, but the book sort of comes down with and goes against the premise that if we sanction Iran enough, or if we intervene militarily, or if we get regime change, that we will be facing a fundamentally different Iran, and that you have had very different leaders, very different systems actually that have pursued very similar strategies, and I'll highlight a couple of those which I think are very relevant for our purposes today. The first one is this notion of balancing. And, you and I wrote this piece about this Iran-China deal a while ago that was sort of all the buzz, right? People were very concerned about Iran now shifting to China. In my mind, you have to sort of think about that in the historical perspective. Iran has long been adopting a policy of balancing. And again, you go back to even in the 18th century, you've had all these great powers that were involved in Iran's neighborhood that were often interfering in Iran itself. And so recognizing that, first of all, self-sufficiency and self-reliance would be key ways for Iran to overcome that, but also recognizing that it didn't really have the means to be fully self-reliant, Iran was often balancing one power against the other. So, you had the French and the British being balanced against each other. Then it was the British and the Russians, and then eventually the Germans and the Americans. And so today, what you're seeing is Russia and China being balanced against each other, but also being balanced against Europe. And so this is something that has been ongoing. And again, I expect that will continue. Even if we have a return to the JCPOA, even if the sanctions are lifted, we're not going to see Iran fundamentally sort of stop this policy and stop cozying up to the Russians and the Chinese, and also balancing those countries off of each other. An additional example that I think is worth sort of highlighting and goes directly to your point about military capabilities. Going back decades and decades, Iran recognized that it was fundamentally militarily weak, and that it was reliant on other countries, including the Russians, including the British, including the French, to maintain some sort of security force for both internal security purposes and external security purposes. And this is actually interesting because the response that was given by the Shah and by his father to this shortcoming was actually building conventional military capabilities, acquiring them from the United States, right? So the Shah was investing in very expensive weapons and was trying to build a large military. But the same drivers led the Islamic Republic to actually kind of develop a different military doctrine. And that is to acquire the asymmetric capabilities that are such a huge part of the list of US grievances and regional grievances with Iran. If you look at Secretary Pompeo's 12 points that he would like where he would like Iran to change its behavior, so many of them are about these capabilities, missiles, support for proxies. And so these, again, are not things that are fundamentally new to Iran, to the Islamic Republic. Even Iran's support for non-state actors is not just linked to the Islamic Republic. It goes back before the Islamic Revolution itself. And so recognizing these areas of continuity, in my mind, is critical, because it allows us to stop having this sort of myopic view of Iran and this perception that if we can just sort of sanction Iran enough, or even strike its nuclear facilities, or create regime change, that we will be able to change its policies fundamentally.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting point that you raised, namely that often we look at Iran's support for proxies in the region as a expansionist policy, and the Arab line is that Iran has no business in the Arab world, and what you lay out is that it's essentially a weapon system. It's a compensation for weak, conventional military capability compared to what the United States invests in Iran's rivals, and I would always think that perhaps giving so much money to so much weapons to Iran's Arab rivals is exactly would make the Iran more motivated to invest in proxies. And that sort of raises another interesting issue, which takes me back to some points you raised. Whoever wants to engage Iran, you had a scenario in which it might even be President Trump, a different President Trump arriving. Although I think he has a higher threshold, having Soleimani's blood on his hands in Iranian views. But let's say it's either Trump, who's really serious now about legacy building and wants to talk to Iran, or it's the Biden administration. And I'm wondering what in your mind would be the right kind or kinds of confidence building signals that either Iranians need to send to the US or the US needs to send to Iran, and how you might see that different between a Trump and a Biden administration to actually get the process going. And one thinks maybe there's an early phase, but if there's progress towards something bigger, which I know the Americans want, more than just going back to JCPOA, but opening the door to additional conversations, what is it that needs to be done to repair the damage of the past 4 years, at least signaling in a positive way?
Well, I think time is the first and foremost thing that will be needed, right? Just to kind of put a, I guess, fine point on it, when Iran decided to return to the negotiating table in 2012 initially, and then, with just the United States kind of in the secret meetings that were taking place, and then later on out in the open with the rest of the P5+1 in 2013, one of the things that was often said at the highest levels of the Iranian government was, we can't trust the United States to abide by this deal that we're about to strike. And what is fascinating is that, in the United States, you'll recall this in that time frame, much of the conversation was about how do we prevent Iran from cheating? How do we prevent Iran from violating the deal? How do we prevent Iran from withdrawing from the deal? But of course, Iran had the same sort of conversations and had the same ideas about the United States. But of course, from a US perspective, it was unimaginable, I think, that the United States would be the one that would pull the plug on the deal first. So I think there is now a bit of a reckoning in the United States that this is something we have to be dealing with, that yes, a potential future administration, even if, say, you have a President Biden for a while, he returns to the JCPOA, but then if he loses again in 4 or 8 years and you have a Republican who replaces him, you could very well have that administration pull the plug on the JCPOA and whatever other arrangements would have been made to deal with other areas of Iranian behavior policies. So that's the first thing to consider. And I'm not sure that there is a whole lot of remedy for Iran to feel secure in that in whatever arrangement it decides to enter into, because even with treaties, as we are again seeing with the Trump administration, yes, it's a bit more difficult and perhaps politically costly to pull out of a deal, but of a treaty, but it's not impossible. So there is no real sort of airtight measure that the United States can take to show Iran that it would not withdraw from a deal down the line. But I think there's a few things that the U.S. can do pretty immediately after a new administration. Actually, these are things that even the Trump administration could do, though I suspect that it's not really going to be inclined to do so. One would be, overturning the travel ban, which is disproportionately affecting Iranians. I don't think that's necessarily a concern for the regime. It is a concern for, the population and, of course, Iranian Americans who don't get to see their families. But I think it would be a signal of sort of good faith that this is, a change, and this is a new sort of administration that is coming to power. A second one would be to deal with the humanitarian trade situation, which, as we know, although US sanctions are not directly targeting the import of medical devices, medicine, et cetera, into Iran, they are certainly making it much more challenging. And so a new administration could sort of send, help facilitate that humanitarian trade, which would not only be the right thing to do, but I think would again be the right sort of signal that it is willing to engage, that it's not looking to harm Iranians for the sake of harming Iranians, that it's, it's sort of looking at sanctions as a tool rather than what it seems like an end in itself under this current administration. On the Iranian side, I think you could see a number of things that Iran could do as confidence building measures. One would be, and they haven't done this in a while, but it's something that happens periodically, the IRGC Navy harassing the US Navy in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. So that would be one area to sort of de-escalate tensions. And the second area would be in Iraq, where, again, Iranian proxies have been targeting US, not just forces, but also diplomatic facilities and US interests. So that would be another place where sort of getting a time out, I think, would be a good signal, and also would also create the space for negotiations to move forward.
Let me ask you one final question before we go to the audience. And I'm sure you've heard this debate a lot here about, there are multiple things on the table the US has with Iran. There is JCPOA, and how does the United States get Iran to commit to more concessions on the nuclear front? There's the issue of missiles, and there's the issue of proxies. And there are people who think that everything should be on the table at the beginning, and there are those who want to focus on JCPOA. I'm wondering, aside from your assessment of what is the best course going forward, is that how would Iran interpret, the different approaches the United States might have to addressing all of these issues?
So, I think, and I think this is an area of debate and tension within Iran itself, right? That there is no single view about what Iran should be willing to negotiate on. With the nuclear issue, there was a lot of backlash. There was a lot of pushback against the notion of negotiating with the United States. But ultimately, the decision made at the, again, highest levels, including the Supreme Leader, but also other key power centers, to include the IRGC, made it not easy, but it made it possible to have a nuclear deal. That is going to be a lot trickier with Iran's missile program or regional activities, because at least on the nuclear side, we know that Iran had stopped weapon-related activities prior to returning to the negotiating table. But with Iran's missiles and proxies, again, these are the core pillars of Iran's national security strategy and defense today. And so giving up either of those things would make Iran, from Iran's perspective, it would make Iran incredibly vulnerable. If Iran didn't have Hezbollah to count on, Lebanese Hezbollah and the Shia militias in Iraq and the Houthis and other groups, it would see its influence in the region dramatically diminished. It would, from, again, its own perspective, it wouldn't be able to deter adversaries like the United States and Israel as effectively, as easily. It wouldn't have the means to defend itself should a conflict happen. And same thing with Iran's missiles. So that means that it is a lot trickier, in my mind, to get limitations on those activities. And I should also add that, with nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, we, being both the United States, but also the international community, have a long track record and history of striking these deals like that, right? You have the whole U.S. USSR arms control history to build on. So it's a technical, you are able to get technical sort of deals that are verifiable, that are easy to implement. We know how to do it. On the support for proxies, that is going to be a lot trickier. There's going to be a lot more, how do you verify that sort of deal, right? So there are a number of additional challenges to take into account. I think fundamentally, though, there is a recognition within Iran, based on the JCPOA experience, that you're not going to see the full economic recovery that Iran wants without a broader deal. And the reason why I say this is that even in 2016, prior to President Trump being elected, Iran was not happy with the course of sanctions relief. And Iranian officials often complained that the United States was not, quote unquote, meeting its end of the bargain because they were not seeing the economic recovery that they wanted. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to get into this too much, but there are a number of factors that were making it more difficult for Iran to see that economic recovery. And among those, including, corruption, mismanagement, the role of the IRGC in key sectors, you also had the existing sanctions that were not going to be lifted, those under the terrorism authorities, for example, right? And so I think there's a recognition that unless they're able to deal with these things and get broader sanctions relief, that they will continue to struggle with the economic recovery side of things. But again, getting some sort of consensus on what areas of Iran's missile program and support for proxies and regional activities to kind of put on the table, that is going to be a very tricky one to navigate. And as a result, I think fairly lengthy negotiations.
Thank you. I have a lot more questions, but I think it's time for us to sort of see what questions the audience might have. So I'll turn it over to Nargis for that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ariane, for a really interesting conversation so far. So we're getting a ton of questions. Some you've already touched upon a little, but there are aspects of it that folks are still asking about. So I'll pose them one by one, and I might, there's a few that I think go together. So I'll let you know when there's a couple questions on the table. But the first one is, the one audience member asked, is there consensus in Iran for returning to the JCPOA if the US does? And they asked, I've seen several recent interviews in Hamshari newspaper lauding the deal and negotiations, but don't know how far that sentiment extends.
The short answer is no. There is no consensus about whether Iran should return to the deal. And in fact, if you sort of look at the more what we would kind of characterize as hardliners, we can just use it as a shorthand right now. There are a number of individuals and groups who who were already opposed to the JCPOA, but ultimately folded because of what I was describing as a sort of system level decision. But who are now even more distrustful and who believe that the experience of the JCPOA itself shows that Iran should not return to the JCPOA. And that's typically the camp that privileges, prioritizes self-reliance or prioritizes relationships with countries like Russia and China as a way to keep Iran afloat and avoid sort of, returning to a deal with the United States. I think ultimately the fact that Iran hasn't withdrawn from the deal, the fact that it has decided to take those reversible steps I was describing earlier on, and to not take steps like dialing down monitoring and verification, cutting the access of international inspectors, all indicate that the sort of broader system level decision is to keep the JCPOA and see what happens. But it's certainly not a consensus. There are a number of people who disagree with that premise.
Great, thanks. And some of the recent reporting also showing that within the population there seems to be also something that seems to be new, which is that folks are thinking that it doesn't really matter whether it's a Trump or Biden administration as far as the way that the U.S. will and the repercussions of whatever ends up happening in Iran. I think sort of it is interesting in all of this, given that for so long the population, especially in the voting booth, seemed to favor engagement with the West and the United States, but that might be changing given how the Trump administration has acted. Go for that, yeah.
So that is an interesting thing to me as well, because as you know, there's been there are different views of what U.S. politics look like and what U.S. politics entail in Iran, right? There is not and I think that's easy to forget when you're, especially in D.C., because we're so in the middle of all of it. But from a lot of, a number of people within the system, within the elites, but also I think within the population, tend to see Democrats and Republicans as ultimately the same when it comes to foreign policy, right? That regardless of what sort of administration you have in the United States, that the policy is the same. Now, I happen to disagree with that. And, again, I think it's sort of, when we live in the middle of it, for some of us, literally, it's sort of easy to see those differences because you're seeing every single statement and detail that is coming out in all the areas of debate. But from the Iranian perspective, you've had sanctions regardless of what sort of administration was in power. You've had Middle Eastern wars regardless of what sort of administration was in power. And so it's easy to I think, for them, or it's perhaps difficult for them to see the nuances of each of these policy areas.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, going off of that, another audience member asks, if Biden does win, what are the main obstacles that his administration would face in re-entering the JCPOA or beginning new talks on other regional issues? So I know you've touched upon this in your comments before, but sort of taking that and the conversation that we were just having about internal views about this, what do you think might be some of these main obstacles?
Yeah, I think certainly the push and pull within Iran is going to be a source of concern. That you might have elements within Iran that would like to come back to the negotiating table, re-enter the JCPOA, or have the U.S. return into the JCPOA and start negotiations on other issues immediately. But that is going to be very difficult. You have a parliament that is currently, majority conservative. You have a sort of a pragmatic or a moderate, I guess, let's say, government that has put all of its political power, all of its political capital into the JCPOA experiments that has not gone too well for Iran. And so being able to sell the rest of the system on this notion of a continued negotiation is going to be difficult. On the U.S. side, again, I think the fate of the U.S. Congress and the makeup of the U.S. Congress is going to be pretty important here, and also to remind everyone that even in 2016, the JCPOA was it didn't even have a complete democratic support, let alone bipartisan support. And we're not likely to see bipartisan support now, right? Not the least after everything that has happened. And I think that even getting full democratic support for a return to the JCPOA will be challenging. And of course, the Israelis, the Saudis, and others are not going to stop being active on this front. And I think that now with these sort of new dialogues and the normalization efforts in the region, which are largely aimed at sort of isolating Iran, that there is going to be perhaps a renewed united front against the JCPOA and engagement efforts with Iran in the region, which is going to, again, make it more complicated for a Biden administration to return to the JCPOA.
Great, thank you. So there are two questions on China, which I'm going to pose together for you. One is, how has the prospective strategic partnership agreement between Iran and China affected U.S. Iran relations, and what would be the scenario based on a victory of Joe Biden? And a second question, but in the same theme, is, can you speak to the role China may play in any scenario involving the JCPOA? After all, the total collapse of the JCPOA may further benefit Iran's growing involvement and dependence on China. That's a question. Would it benefit it? And would the Chinese continue to be enthusiastic participants of the JCPOA?
So I think there's a few elements here. The first one is that the Chinese want to be seen as a responsible mediating power, and that's sort of the brand that they've been pushing since the start of the JCPOA talks. And as a result of that, even during the nuclear negotiations, they stepped in on a couple of occasions to push things forward when they seem to be stalling a little bit. And they have continued to, of course, stay in the JCPOA. They haven't been as active a member of the P5+1, in part because there's actually not a whole lot that China and Russia can do right now. It's mostly on the Europeans and, of course, the United States. From Iran's perspective, the sanctions relief it wanted and the support it wanted was from Europe and not necessarily Russia and China, which it already had secured. But so the sort of, Chinese willingness to be seen as a prominent, sort of responsible, mediating power is one of the drivers behind its continued participation in the JCPOA and why it will continue to stay in the JCPOA as long as the JCPOA exists. The second part of it is non-proliferation concerns, right? China, much like Russia, actually, has a number of interests it has to balance, but it definitely doesn't want another nuclear armed state. Least of all in the Middle East, where it has strategic interests. And so that is another reason why it has been it has been part of the JCPOA, will remain part of the JCPOA. Now, in terms of what sort of role it will play if a Biden administration wins, I think actually not just China, but the rest of the P5+1 won't be playing a huge role because this will really be about the lifting of U.S. sanctions, and only the United States can do that. So I think that if we see a return to the JCPOA, it will be a predominantly bilateral affair. And the other players, of course, will play a role, will be there, will be at the table, and will continue to be involved in various projects, the redesign of the Arak heavy water reactor, for example, but they're not going to be the drivers behind or even the key players in this process. In terms of the impact on the broader U.S.-Iran relationship, as I was describing, Iran has had this history of balancing, and that's something that is not going to go away, regardless of its relationship with the United States in the foreseeable future. It is clear, though, that Iran has benefited from its relationship with China to some extent, but it's also become perhaps overtly reliant on China, which is another source of controversy within the country, right? The COVID-19 spread in Iran actually exemplified this notion that Iran was one of the first countries to become a hotspot for the disease, and it was due to the fact that it was so reliant on trade with China. Is not an insignificant thing. But at the same time, China, along with Russia, has allowed Iran to overcome some of the isolation that the United States has been trying to kind of drive Iran into. And that's also an important thing. So today, in terms of economic, political, security, and military and technology sectors, Iran does and is continuing to build its relationship with China, and I suspect it will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. Though we should also, again, another caveat here is that the Chinese, and this is from the Iranian perspective, are not the most are not a partner that can be fully trusted. They tend to drag their feet on projects. They don't always deliver on their promises. And so one of the things to take into account when thinking about this this Iran-China deal is precisely that there's a lot of promises that are made there. It's not clear how many of them will actually ultimately be delivered.
Thanks, Ariane. We're getting so many questions. I'm having a hard time. You're generating the most questions we've had so far. So I'm just trying to go through the different platforms and collate these. Okay, there's a couple that I want to get to, and then I have a question that I want us. I know we're reaching the end of time too, but so one attendee is asking, with recent news of the U.S. sending officials to Syria to negotiate the release of American hostages with Assad, I was shocked and wondered what hope we have of the American and dual citizens jailed in Iran. There's been little to no movement on them, but if Syria, why not Iran?
I think that's a question that others will answer better than I can. I don't really focus on this area. I do think that there's been some movement on this, right? During the Trump administration, I believe 2 Americans were released. But in my mind, and one of the most effective ways to do this is actually to cooperate with allies and partners who also have, their nationals who are currently held in Iran, to include Australia, the UK, and France. And I don't know how much of this is going on, but I think that sort of having a united front and explaining to Iran and raising the cost of continuing this policy of hostage taking as a means of gaining, traction, as a means of accumulating bargaining chips, is really something that needs to be done more, and it's something that needs to be done on an international, I think, level. But yeah, I think that should be a priority for the potential Biden administration, and certainly if the Trump administration continues, then it should be a priority for them.
So one of the things that I really loved about the comments that you were making earlier, and overall the type of work that you've done for your book, is place in a critical historical context Iran's geopolitical calculations, and actually drawing, as you were talking to us in your remarks, drawing a continuum between what's going on post-revolutionary in the post-revolutionary context with the pre. I mean, in so much of our understandings of Iran, there tends to be this divide where 1979, it's like everything that happened prior to that, all of a sudden, let's whitewash it all, and now we have something new. And what I really appreciate about your comments and the work that you're doing in your book is that you're actually showing that there are historical lineages. There are things that are not just defined and broken apart by 1979 and the revolution. So I wonder, using that historical context and knowledge that you have, and then also thinking about what has transpired over the past 3.5, 4 years, especially given the signing of the JCPOA and what happened since then, how do you think, what do you think the not necessarily the nuts and bolts of how can the U.S. get back into the JCPOA or sanctions relief and this and that, but sort of more generally on the calculations and the thinking of both those in the political elite as well as in the intellectual sphere about the thinking of Iran's relationship with the United States writ large, given what's happened in these past few years, and also specifically in regards to Iran's relationship with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the region, given also the role that they've sort of taken on in the past few years with the Trump administration. So how does that bode within this larger historical tableau that you're sort of painting for us?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, and just to take a step back and sort of, reiterate your point about the divide, right? One of the things that was striking to me is that most books on Iran's military or security policies or foreign policy begin in 1979, and very few of them sort of look at the entirety of, certainly not the entirety of the history. That would be unmanageable. But looking, sort of going back a few decades and looking at that. And I think that's a broader sort of IR problem, right? That you have this tendency to see revolutions as these clear cuts. And so much of the literature, not just in Iran, but broadly in terms of international relations, takes that for granted. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of challenge that in the Iranian context. And I suspect that there are lessons there for people who study Russia and China and know more about those countries than I do. But in terms of the thinking today, I think a few things are potentially reinforcing some of the kind of lessons that Iranians have taken from their history that I described. One thing that I think might be worth noting here is that, when the JCPOA was concluded, one of the lines of attack against the JCPOA was that it was the modern Turkmenchai, right? Now, to you, this is familiar because just recently with the Iran-China deal, people were again talking about a new Turkmenchai. And for context, this is a treaty that is seen widely today still as one of the most humiliating agreements that Iran has ever had. It lost chunks of territory after a war with Russia to Russia. And so it is seen as a deeply humiliating experience for Iranians. And so every time you've had these new agreements, critics have inevitably turned to Turkmenchai as the model, right, and have talked about Turkmenchai being repeating itself. And also interesting here is that Turkmenchai was concluded, and Iranians see it as the result of their country, their statements' incompetence, right? And they see things like the JCPOA and the Iran-China deal as also being the result of incompetence by their statesmen. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing is, I was describing the sort of isolation that Iran is now seeing with the UAE-Israel deal being announced and other sort of normalization efforts in the region. I think those things are all going to reinforce that experience, the experience of the JCPOA withdrawal by the United States and reimposition of sanctions are all going to reinforce this notion that Iran needs to be self-sufficient, that it needs to be that it is isolated and it is vulnerable in its region. And all of those are lessons that have been sort of accumulating throughout history in Iran. And that's where you get this fundamental distrust of international agreements and diplomacy as a concept, right? That's why it was so hard to sell the JCPOA and the nuclear negotiations internally for the Iranians. And I think that's why also you'll have a really hard time selling a potential deal, broader deal down the line. So I think these are all sort of reinforcing some of the lessons that I certainly have seen emerge from my research.
Thank you so much. This was such a rich hour, and I wish it could go on because it's a really wonderful conversation. Really, thank you so much, Ariane, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Vali to close it all out for us, but I really appreciate your time and for having you come with us. And also, please, just right before I turn it completely over to Professor Nas, please, you can learn more about Ariane Tabatabai's book, No Conquest, No Defeat, and we will be posting the link to where you can get the book on our YouTube and on our social media accounts, so you can check it out.
Let me second Nargis's thanks. I think this was a very, very rich conversation, learned a lot, and I really look forward to reading your book. And Ariane is one of the best minds on Iran's security policy. Her work on varieties of aspects of Iran's security strategy have been really good and illuminating. And this was a really good conversation. And I'm very glad that you took us through a tour of history, which we often forget in these conversations. Thank you again. And I definitely recommend her book to everybody to read. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for having me.
Thank you.